At dawn, 200 silent warriors circled a ranch, and one loaf of bread was to blame. Dawn at Coyote Bend went still as held breath. Calder Hayes set a wedge of cornbread for a starving Apache kid and stepped back with empty hands. Before the stove shook off the chill, the far ridge pulled a rope of dust into a half-moon of horses. No shout, no shot, just silence cinching down on one hard question. Can a small piece of bread be enough to make folks stay with one another? Dawn came thin and cold off the Sacramento mountains, a blade of light shaving the frost from the wire and laying it silver along the muleer draws. Calder Hayes stepped out onto his porch and watched his breath feather once, then go. The mesquite in the stove had burned down to a hard stink, and the coffee in his tin cup carried a faint taste of smoke. On the post by the steps hung the water gauge he'd rigged from a length of glass and a scrap of ruler. What little was left clung to the bottom like a stubborn tear, ringed with a crust of salt. He set the cup on the rail and rolled his shoulders under a canvas coat gone shiny at the seams. The horses in the corral stood without a sound, heads high, ears cutting the air. Even the morning wind seemed to think twice about rattling the yucca blades. Out here a man learned to read quiet the way town men read newspapers. This quiet said something was off. He saddled the dun and took the fence line toward Mule Ear, following the pale thread where the ground kept the night's chill. The sun wasn't up proper yet, but the canyon was already throwing back a thin glare like bone under skin. A jackrabbit broke from a clump of greasewood and ran long and low. After that, nothing moved. Calder found the break in the east stretch where a deadfall had crushed two posts, and he was working a splice when he heard it, the smallest scrape like a spoon across the bottom of a kettle. He straightened slow. 20 paces off, tucked in the blue shade of a yucca, a child crouched on his haunches, digging at the roots with the heel of his hand. The boy's shirt was torn and stiff with dust. You could count each rib like tally marks. His hair lay in ropes against his face, and his eyes were deep set, too old. Calder let the pliers hang from his wrist and eased a hand into his coat pocket. He brought out a wedge of skillet cornbread wrapped in an old feed bill and a strip of jerky from last fall's cull. He set them on a flat stone halfway between them and stepped back 2 paces, palms open. "Easy, kid," he said, quiet as a man at a graveside. "Ain't no trick to it." The boy didn't move at first. Hunger and fear fight hard in a small body. Then his eyes flicked to Calder's hands, to the food, to the empty horizon, and back to the food. He crept forward on the outsides of his feet and took the bread as if it might bite him. He ate without looking away, dry crumbs breaking against his lips, tears leaving clean paths down the gridiron. His cheeks. The jerky went next. He didn't chew so much as work at it like a pup, jaw trembling with the effort. Calder kept his distance. He had seen wild yearlings kill themselves in a gate. When a man came on too quick, he pointed with 2 fingers toward his own mouth, then toward the line of cottonwoods that marked his cabin. He laid a hand on his chest. "Calder," he said, "because names sometimes settle a soul." He touched 2 fingers to the brim of his hat and tipped them to the boy. "Come on now, there's beans." The boy tensed to run, then tried it, took 2 steps, and a limp in the left leg buckled him to a knee. Calder let the moment pass without closing the space between them. The boy pushed up, wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, and nodded once. He followed at a wary angle, keeping the dun horse between them whenever he could. Up close, Calder saw the long welts across the boy's back. Raised and angry, old blood caught in the weave of the shirt. At the house, Calder swung the door with his foot and set the coffee to the side of the firebox, coaxing the beans to a simmer with the splash of water. He tore a clean square from a flour sack and dipped it, then waited till the steam thinned. He set a plate on the floorboards near the door where the boy had settled. back braced against the jam like a coyote in a snare. He didn't press him toward a chair. Some places feel safer close to the open. The boy's hands shook so bad the spoon rattled the tin as he ate. He hustled the food like a man afraid of thieves. Calder looked away and made a show of oiling the lever gun, because dignity matters when a body has none to spare. When the plate was empty, he slid a second toward him with his boot. The boy hesitated, then went at it slower, eyes half closed, listening to the stove tick as the iron cooled. "Reckon you're a long way from your people," Calder said after a time, mostly to the room. The boy's gaze lifted to his face and then to the fire. No answer. It wasn't needed. Calder laid a folded wool blanket on the floor near the hearth and dragged a saddle blanket over it for softness. He took the flour sack rag and, with a nod toward the boy's back, lifted a brow. The kid flinched, then sat very still. Calder cleaned what he could, working gentle and thorough the way he'd untangle barb from a calf's hide. No wasted motion, no extra pain. He found a jar with a smear of tallow and pine pitch and worked it in with 2 fingers. The boy's jaw set like a man riding out a bad stretch. He didn't make a sound. "Reckon that'll do," Calder said, tying off the rag and dropping it in a bucket. "Rest easy, kid. Fire'll hold." The boy's chin sagged to his chest. Sleep took him like a tide. Calder shook a little more coffee into his cup and stepped to the porch. The horses in the corral snorted once and went quiet again, as if the night had slipped its head back through the halter and refused to be led. In today, the air held a tightness he knew from before a storm, only there weren't any clouds worth the name. He looked across the flats toward the mule ear. Something out there had changed the shape of the morning. He couldn't put a word to it till the sun shouldered up and laid a lick of shine along the ridge. Then he saw it for what it was. A thin smear first, then a line, then a train of it. Dust pulled in a long, slow rope, creeping down the far slope toward Coyote Bend. Not a wind devil, not a drover's herd. The kind of dust that comes from a great many hooves that know where they're bound. Inside, the boy slept, small under the wool, breathing steady. Calder set his cup down and rested a hand on the post that held the gauge. The last drop clung and would not fall. The light came up like a knife being honed, thin and bright along the ridge, and the yard held its breath the way a church does when the preacher shuts his Bible. Calder stood at the porch rail with the tin cup warming his palm and tasted cold ash on the steam. The mesquite had burned to a gray bed. One coal winked and went dark. Behind him the boy slept shallow, a small rise and fall under the wool near the stove, the pine pitch salve leaving a faint, clean smell above the old dust and leather. The horses had drifted to the far corner of the corral and stood facing out, ears high, noses working at a wind that wasn't moving. A blue jay hit the fence, cocked its head, and left without a cry. Calder sipped once and set the cup down careful, like noise might spill from it. He fetched a length of brass tube he'd soldered to a cracked pair of field lenses, his spyglass good enough if you knew what you were looking for. He braced an elbow to the post and swept the country slow. Mule ear lay pale and bare-boned, the draws showing like veins. Far off, where the flats gave up to the first lift of land, a freckle of dark pressed against the light. Here and gone, then back again in another place. He moved the glass a finger's width and found 2 more. They were not birds, they were not cattle. In time, a man learns the shape of intent by the way dust behaves. This dust rose and then settled without breaking, too disciplined for a herd, too many for a couple of travelers. He lowered the glass and let the quiet tell him what he already knew. He went inside and checked the rifle by touch, counting the cartridges with his thumb. 12 for the Winchester, 6 for the Colt, 2 extra in the pocket where the lining had torn and been stitched back in a square the size of a dollar bill. He laid out the leather strap he used to brace the door when the wind came wrong and set the heavy plank by the jamb. None of it would stop a storm, but a man sleeps easier when things are in their place. He pulled the blanket up over the boy's shoulder. The kid made a small sound that wasn't pain and wasn't peace and settled again. Calder set a pan of water to warm on the stove and split a plug of coffee off the brick for later. He stood looking at his hands, scar on the web where a cinch ring had bit him years back, the knuckle flattened by a steer's skull, and thought about how weak a fist looked against a whole horizon. A knock came soft as a moth. Not the heel of a lawman. He opened to find May Collins with her shawl caught up against her throat, a covered pot balanced on her hip. Steam curled out in a little ribbon that tasted of pinto beans and a bone boiled long. She had a bundle under one arm, cloth, clean, and folded. "Mornin', Mr. Hayes," she said, voice low like the day might spook. "Heard you took in a stray. Figured beans travel better than talk." Her eyes flicked past his shoulder to the small form by the fire, then back to his face. "If you don't mind me setting this by." "Much obliged, ma'am." Calder stepped aside. "Kid's sleepin'. Took some eatin' last night." She set the pot on the table and unrolled the cloths. "Boiled these in ley. Not pretty, but clean." She didn't say a word about the welts. She didn't touch the boy. She reached for the kettle instead and topped his cup without asking. The old ways that carry a place through bad years are quiet ones. "You be careful today," she said at the door, eyes narrowing against the light. "The wind's got a strange feel, like it's listening." "Ain't the wind, I reckon," Calder said. She studied him a beat, then nodded like she'd found the word she wanted and left, her steps small and sure on the hard ground. He watched her cross the yard and stopped to rub the dun between the eyes. The horse let go a breath it hadn't meant to hold. When she was gone, Calder went back to the porch. The sun had climbed a hand higher, and the world had not warmed with it. He put the brass tube to his eye again. The freckles were more now, and closer, and the space between them had begun to take shape. Men on horseback show themselves even when they try not to. The set of a shoulder, the way a line will creep instead of wander. He marked a mesquite with a notch of his thumbnail, and checked again after he'd counted 50 heartbeats. The line had shifted toward it. He walked the fence to the far gate and squatted where the sandy patch held prints like a page keeps ink. Fresh shoe marks came in from the north and bent south without crossing the creek bed. Each print sat clean on the surface, no crumble at the edges, new laid, heavy. He could make out 3 different patterns of nails set. Out beyond the gate, another run of prints answered those, and another beyond that, each at a careful distance, each turning inward a hair. He stepped from one to the next, counting under his breath. The pattern told him more than any letter could. Whoever they were, they knew their work. They were writing a shape on his land. By the time he reached the corner post, his boots were white with salt dust, and the light had gone to staring. He straightened and looked back toward the house. From this angle, the porch sat like a ship's bow in a dry sea. He could see the boy through the doorway, still sleeping by the glow, one hand open on the blanket, as if he'd let go of something he'd had to carry too long. Calder set his palm to the top wire and felt it hum under the faint pull of the morning. A music-only wire sings. He turned slow, taking in the country one slice at a time. The hoof marks curved and curved again. North and west and east, they were coming around, neat as a compass draws a schoolhouse circle. An arc when he first saw it, now more than that. The silence thickened until the breath of it laid on his tongue like dust. He lifted his head and tasted iron. Out here, trouble didn't always announce itself with a shout. Sometimes it arrived on 1,000 careful steps and set itself down all around you, patient as a snake in shade. waiting for your door to open. By the time the sun lifted clear, the line had closed into shape. Riders took the high ground and the low, set neat as buttons on a shirt, and the curve of them reached from the cottonwoods to the red bluff beyond the corral. They didn't call out. They didn't fire. They sat their horses in a silence that made the boards of the porch creak loud when Calder put his weight there. He kept the Winchester under his palm, but low, the way a man carries a lantern he doesn't mean to swing. The boy woke with a start and pushed to his knees before his eyes were open. He felt the room first, the same way a wild thing knows a snare, and then he found the door and the light and Calder's boots. When he saw past the jam, out to the long arc of riders, his mouth opened without sound. He got to his feet, and his bad leg betrayed him, so he caught the door frame and held on. He didn't cry. His breath came fast and shallow, and the skin pulled tight across his cheekbones. The horses in the semicircle wore paint and bells, wrapped in leather to keep them from talking. Faces were striped with clay. Wings of color fanned across cheek and brow. Lances threw thin shadows that reached like fingers toward the yard. Calder had seen war parties before, younger and eager, all fire and noise. This wasn't that. This was the weight of decision come to sit in the dust and wait for a man to step wrong. One rider left the line and came forward at a walk. He was not young. The years had cut their own beadwork into his face, and each line lay there like it belonged. Eagle quills stood in his hair. A coil of whip hung from his hand, dark where sweat and weather and other things had taken hold and never quite let go. He stopped his horse 20 feet from the porch and let the quiet put itself between them. Calder eased the rifle butt to the floorboards and lifted his hands, not high, not begging, just open. The old man's eyes weighed him, and then the boy. "White man," the rider said, his English careful, each word set. "Where he wanted it. You hold what is ours." The boy's fingers found Calder's pant leg and stayed there. Calder didn't look down. "Kid came starving," he said. "I ain't taking what's not mine." The old man's gaze did not change. He leaned and touched the coil of whip to his thigh, as if the weight of it told him something about the day. "He is kin," he said. "He left the camp by himself. He ran from law." His eyes slid once to the stove smoke lifting straight up, and then back to Calder. "Law older than your fences." Calder kept his voice low, like you'd talk to a spooked colt. "He's 8, best I can tell. Hunger will make a thief out of a saint." Around the curve of riders, small things happened. Hands shifted on reins, a knee pressed, a feather trembled. The old man did not turn to them. "He took corn held for winter," he said, "not for one mouth, for all." His chin lifted toward the boy, and for the first time a shadow moved behind his eyes. Not anger, not yet. "He is son of my brother's blood. When such a one breaks what holds us together, he learns the cord that binds." Calder looked past the old man at the line of horses and men, and then back into that weathered face. "I read you plain, sir," he said, "but a whip won't teach a starving boy what sharing means. It'll just teach him to run faster." The boy's grip on his leg tightened, then eased. He whispered a word Calder didn't know, a soft sound that might have been a name. The old man heard it too. His mouth set for a breath, then let go. "You will return him," the old man said. It wasn't a threat. It was what a man says when he's naming the next thing in a list. Calder's hands stayed open. "I'll not hand a child into pain he can't survive." The wind came a little then, only enough to stir the mesquite ash in the firebox and lift the edge of the flour sack on the table. The silence after it felt like a door swung shut. Out in the curve, a rider shifted, and the jingle of a bit chimed and died. 2 crows crossed the sky together, and their shadows ran across the yard side by side. long and thin as whips. The old man clicked his tongue once, and his horse took one patient step closer. He lifted the coil so the boy could see it clear. "You think we beat him because we hate him," he said. "You think we are cruel." He let the words sit, then shook his head one time. Slow. "We keep a fire in winter because we love our old. We keep law for the same reason. If we lose it, no corn will reach the mouths you do not see from your porch." Calder could feel his heart beat under his shirt like a fist he couldn't unclench. He wanted to say 100 things and knew none of them would help. He tried a smaller one. "Let me feed him and doctor him till sundown," he said. "Let him sleep where he did not last night. We can speak again in the cool." The old man looked at the boy as if to measure how much of him was still child, and how much was already the thing he would have to be. He nodded once, not to Calder but to something between them both, and then he did a simple, terrible kindness. He lowered his hand and loosened the coil until the end of the whip slipped down and kissed the porch board by Calder's boot. The sound it made was nothing much, dry leather to dry wood, but it carried. It said time, it said choice. He gathered the coil again. "Sundown," he said. Then he reined his horse without hurry and turned back to the line, and the line breathed as one and settled, a living fence laid around a man's yard. Calder stood there with his hands empty and felt the shape of the day pressed down. Inside, the boy stared at the place where the leather had touched the plank, as if the board itself had spoken. Calder reached for the cup and found his fingers wouldn't close. He set his hand flat on the rail instead and watched the old man ride back into the silence he'd brought with him. The gauge on the post held its stingy tear of water. It did not fall. By noon the light had gone hard and short, the kind that makes a man squint at his own shadow. Flies worried the lip of the water bucket, and the horses switched their tails without spirit. Calder spent the heat hours inside, where the stove's ash still gave a low comfort. He cleaned the boy's back again with maize boiled cloths and the pine pitch salve, working slow, saying nothing. The kid took it like a little soldier, eyes fixed on the stove door, jaw set till the muscle twitched, then loosened when Calder tied off the rag and tossed it to the bucket. Beans simmered, bread warmed on the lid. When the boy drowsed, Calder pulled a chair just outside the door and watched the yard bleach itself white. The riders didn't move. They sat there half-moon like a second horizon, patient as old stone. A man could get used to a threat that shouted. This one said nothing and said enough. Shadows stretched thin, then began to thicken. When the sun slid to the rim and stuck there a moment like something caught, the old man came again. He brought 2 others with years in their faces and ash in their braids. They stopped where they had before, 20 feet of dust between men who could end a day 2 very different ways. Calder stood, set the Winchester upright against the porch rail, and took his hands away from it like it was a hot brand he meant to let cool. He raised both palms just enough to show they were empty. He kept his voice low and even. "Chief," he said, "when a boy's ate and starved, fear eats lessons whole." The old man's eyes did a slow pass over the yard, gauge on the post, the dun in the corral, the boy's small shape by the stove through the open door, and came back to Calder's face. The whip hung quiet from his hand, dark as old rain. "You speak for him," he said, "not a question, not praise." "I'm speaking for the part of him you'll need later," Calder said. "The part that'll hold a law because he understands it, and not because he's afraid of the rope that ties it down." He let the silence breathe, then gave the thing he'd turned over in his head all afternoon. "Let him stay here a moon. He eats regular. He learns to read sky and thirst, and why a fence means a calf lives to winter. He sees a man share the last biscuit, because that's the way a place like this holds together. When the moon turns back, I'll ride him to you and stand there while you judge." The evening took the sound out of the world and put it someplace far off. One of the elders shifted in his saddle. Leather creaked. Far out past the cottonwoods a coyote barked twice and shut up. The old man uncoiled a hand's worth of the whip and let the end fall to the porch again. It made the same dry kiss on the plank. Calder didn't look down. "If he is to be chief, he must feel the cord," the old man said. "Not only the warmth of your stove." "He'll feel it," Calder said. "I ain't asking you to burn your law. I'm asking you to temper it." The old man weighed those words like he would a piece of metal in his palm, testing what it might bear. He looked at the boy again, and something eased. Not much in the tight around his mouth. "One moon," he said at last. "He stays at your fire. He learns what your people call decent." The word sat in his mouth like a stone he'd decided to keep. "When the moon returns, he comes to us. You will bring him. You will speak. If he is harmed here or if he runs, we come back." His eyes held Calder's. Not to talk. "That's fair by me," Calder said. The old man reached into his saddlebag and tossed a small leather pouch tied with a strip of raw hide. It hit the porch and rolled to Calder's boot. He picked it up and felt the shapes through the leather: bone needle, a twist of sage, a lump of resin. Medicine you carry when you mean to set a thing right and not just cover it. "For his back," the old man said. "For your word." Then he turned his horse. The elders turned with him. Out on the line, men moved together as if some hand invisible had tugged a rein, and the half-moon loosened into a slow river of riders. They did not whoop. They did not look back. They went the way dust goes when a day is finished with its work. Calder stood on the porch until the world found its breath again. The horses in the corral blew and shook their manes. The gauge clung to its stingy tear. He went inside, knelt by the hearth, and set the pouch on the blanket where the boy could see it when he woke. "You'll stay a month," he said, not knowing how many of the words would land. "Then we ride east together. I'll stand up with you. That's a promise." The boy's eyes opened out of sleep and held his. He reached and put his hand on the pouch, then on Calder's wrist, shy and sure in the same motion. "Much obliged," he said, the words bent but whole. He turned his face to the warmth and slept again. Dark came up gentle. The stove ticked as the iron settled. Out on the flats, the dust of the war party trailed away and laid itself down. Beyond the far bend, farther than a man could see from a porch, another kind of dust had begun to lift. Days settled like dust on a shelf. Morning began with the stove ticking awake and the smell of coffee going from bitter to right. Calder showed the boy how to roll a rope clean. No kinks, no lazy loops, and how a bowline will hold when a half-hitch won't. He set a stake and made Dawson tie and untie it till the kid's fingers learned the shape without his eyes. Out at the pens he taught him to read a calf's ear for frostbite, to check a hoof for stone, to listen through a rib cage for the slow drum that says an animal's not in trouble yet. The boy didn't waste words. He took the rope like it was a language and answered in the same. Around noon, when heat stood up off the yard in shimmers, Dawson paid back in kind. He squatted in the dust and dragged a twig through it, showing wind the way a map shows rivers, small arrows for the low breeze, long for the high, and his hand turned them so Calder could feel with his eyes how a gust would curl off the bluffs and lay a scent where a coyote could take it. He tapped the funeral of a horned lizard with one knuckle, delicate tracks like leaves, then found the live one under a patch of shade and let it crawl onto his palm. The boy smiled, quick and gone, when it puffed and let itself be rock again. May came most afternoons with a pot on her hip and a bundle of clean cloths under her arm. She set a chair under the eave and worked the boy's hair with soap she'd boiled from lye and bear grease, her thumbs careful along the tender spots. She said little. "Head up a touch, sugar, and don't let suds sting your eye." And once, when she'd finished combing out the burrs and set the toothy bone comb on the step to warm, she patted his shoulder through the shirt and left her hand there one heartbeat longer than was needed. Dasan looked away and breathed through his nose like he was learning how to be still without bracing for hurt. Zeke Carter showed one evening with a sack over his shoulder and the smell of the forge still in his coat. He dumped a mess of scrap on the porch plank, an old hobble ring, a bit of wagon spring, nails bent like fish hooks, and chose a piece that had known plenty of work. He set down a hand anvil shaped like a little church roof and tapped the iron till it remembered how to be straight. When he was done, he put a small knife in the boy's hand, the handle wrapped in rawhide, the edge honest but not eager. "For work," Zeke said, eyes steady. "Not fight." The boy nodded serious and slid the knife into a slit Calder had cut inside the waistband of his pants. The place it rode was secret and safe. Doc Grady came by in the yellow part of day when long shadows make everything thoughtful. He checked the welts by lamplight, glasses low on his nose, fingers smelling faintly of carbolic and tobacco. He grunted once, the good way. "He'll heal," he said, "if folks let him." After that, he blew dust off a deck of old cards and showed Dawson a trick where the ace comes back no matter how you chase it off. The boy didn't smile, not quite, but his eyes followed the old man's hands like a cat tracks a moth. Evenings fell wide and slow. Calder and the kid sat the stoop with 2 slices of skillet bread cooling on their palms and watched swallows take the last light out of the yard. Eli Downs, freckled, all elbows, rode up twice a week with news from the south pasture and a pocket knife he was forever sharpening. He taught Dasan to whittle a whistle from willow, and the 2 of them took turns making a noise that wasn't music but was not nothing either. "For luck," Eli said, handing over the better one. Dasan blew it once and tucked it into his shirt like a little promise. All the while the gauge on the post climbed a hair and fell a hair and never told the whole truth. Some nights the wind slid under the door and laid a cool across the floorboards, and Dawson curled into it the way a pup will find the last square of shade. Calder learned the boy's steps in the dark, the 3-beat pattern of the bad leg, and got so he could tell when the kid had woken from a hard dream by the way the stovepipe would ping, one sharp, one dull, and then go quiet, as if the iron itself wanted to keep secrets. The month wasn't up, not near, when the yard changed its breathing again. Around midnight, a coyote laughed out beyond the creek and then cut it off mid-joke. Calder's eyes opened. He felt the house listening. He eased from his bunk and crossed to the door barefoot, the boards cool and carrying every sound. The night smelled of sage and the old iron of the sky. Out by the yucca line, something darker than dark stood a heartbeat too long and then moved the wrong way, for an animal. Calder waited, without scratching the itch between his shoulder blades. He let his hand rest on the door jamb, where the wood had been polished, smooth by other hands in other years. In the morning he said nothing, and life swung back to its small chores. But when the sun went down again, a pale wedge of new moon hung over the far bend like a cut nail, and Dawson stood under it and touched the place on his back where the skin had learned to knit. He looked to the east as if his eyes could make out faces across the miles, then back to the yard where a tin cup steamed on the rail and a man watched over him without noise. Later, far out on the flats where road meets not road, a handful of lights bloomed and held. They did not move like stars. They opened one by one, slow as flowers that meant to be fire, and stitched a faint ring in the dark. Night came without a moon, and the yard took on that hollow sound a tin cup makes when you set it down wrong. Calder was mending a latigo by lamplight when the first glow showed on the far flats One flame, then three, then a handful more, bobbing slow like lanternfish in a black river. He blew the lamp and let the dark settle. Out at the stove, May's kettle hummed to itself, the lid shivering a little with steam. Dasan slept on his side near the fire, the whistle Eli had carved tucked warm against his chest. The flames drew together and made a necklace around the place. Men stepped from the dark to stand behind their own lights, shadows tall and thin on the ground. Horses snorted and tossed, throwing sparks with their breath. The ring tightened, not rushed, not sloppy, the way a snare knows the shape of a rabbit. 12, 14. More than that, Calder counted silhouettes by habit and let the number go before it scared him. A voice rolled in like a bad sermon. "Hayes, send the kid out. Nobody has to get hurt." The man didn't need to name himself. His talk did it for him. Marshal Whitlock wore authority like a stolen coat, too big in the shoulders, too short in the sleeves, but he strutted in it anyway. Calder stayed in the shadow of the door and said nothing. The night did not need more noise. "You harborin' a fugitive from treaty law," Whitlock called. "That Bratz people raided a supply train south of Tularosa last week, took flour, shot a teamster. Time to send a message they'll read." May looked at Calder, her eyes steady in the low glow. She didn't whisper. She didn't have to. They'd both lived long enough to know a lie when it smiled at them. She set 2 tin cups on the table, lifted a spoon, and tapped the rim. 1, 2, 3, soft and even, a rhythm she and Calder had used once before when a mare foaled wrong and they needed hands without calling the world. Out in the firelight, a big-shouldered shape eased forward on a bay with a white eye. Cole Brannigan. Hat pulled low, coat open enough to show he'd already cleared leather once tonight and wasn't sorry about it. "Evenin', Hayes," he said, voice easy as creek water that's deeper than it looks. "Let's not make it sour. Hand the boy over. Law's the law." Calder put his back to the jam and watched the flames throw long color up the white eye of the bay. "Ain't no law in a lie," he said plain. "Ain't been a mescalero raid in a year, and you know it." Whitlock laughed, a sound without heat. "Heard that from who? The kid? Or his uncle with the paint and feathers?" The ring chuckled the way a crowd will when it wants to be brave together. May poured coffee and let the smell roll out slow and kind, the way mercy does when it's got no business showing up. She set 1 cup by the sill where Calder's hand could find it without looking. Her other hand went to the kettle lid to keep it from rattling. Dasan stirred and turned his face deeper into the blanket, breathing the quiet the stove gave off. "Look here, Marshal," Calder said, letting the words find their own weight. "The boy's under a tribal judgment. I gave my word I'd see him through the month and take him east. You break that circle, you won't just be stealing a child, you'll be lighting the country." "Hell, Hayes," Whitlock said, like a man chiding a pup. "The country's wanted lighting a long time. Folks been skittish, a good blaze clears brush." The men behind him shifted. Some nodded, not sure what they were nodding at. Some kept their eyes down like they'd come too far to turn and didn't know how to stay. Calder heard leather whisper and metal click, the language of guns when they settle into a shape they were made for. The door brace rope creaked a small, tight music. Cole nudged the white-eyed bay up 2 paces. "Don't take it personal," he said. "We ain't after you. Hand the kid over and go back to your coffee." Calder took the cup May had set out and felt the heat in it, the little curl of steam on his knuckles. He drank once, slow for the look of it as much as the swallow. He set the cup down careful, as if it might break the dark. "That kid eats at my fire," he said. "So do I. That's personal enough." Whitlock's voice lost its grin. "You got 1 minute, Hayes. Then we come in for what's ours." May tapped the spoon again. 1, 2, 3, and laid it down. The sound hardly carried, but in the bone of the house it was loud. Calder slid a glance to her and saw she'd already moved the bucket to the corner of the door, the one thing a man can kick into a man's shins at the last second without thinking. She had wound a dishcloth around her palm, not to fight with, but to catch a hot kettle if it needed carrying someplace unfriendly. The small ways people make a stand don't always look like stands. The ring tightened another loop. Torches lowered. Men leaned into their own courage and into each other's backs. Somewhere off to the right, a horse danced and threw sparks with a shoe on rock. Somewhere to the left, a man coughed and wished he hadn't. Calder looked down at Dawson, who was awake now, eyes wide and black, the whistle in his fist. He put 2 fingers against the boy's wrist, steady as he could, and pressed once. "Stay," the kid nodded. He looked smaller than a decision and bigger than a life. "Time's up," Whitlock said. A hush fell that wasn't quiet so much as space, the kind the Lord leaves in a psalm for a man to think whether he means to sing the next line. Calder took one breath and felt how thin it was. He set his hand on the doorknob. From the black beyond the far side of the yard came another sound, low first like thunder rolling behind hills, then clearer, iron on stone, leather on leather, 2 dozen hoofbeats coming hard and together, not the ring of torches, not the wind. A third piece on the board, cutting across sand toward fire. Whitlock's men turned their heads, torches unsteady in their hands. Cole raised his chin and squinted into the dark where the yard wasn't lit. The horses in the corral threw up their heads and blew as if they smelled rain. May's eyes found Calder's in the half-light. She didn't ask. He didn't answer. The night was bringing company, and it wasn't the kind to knock. The sound came in a pack, iron ringing clean, hooves eating ground, the kind of rhythm that means a line and not a mob. The torch ring wavered. Whitlock's head snapped toward the dark jaw set like a trap. Calder held his place. May set the kettle lid down soft and drew her shawl tight, the spoon already where her fingers could find it again. They came in from the north road at a trot, not showy, not scared. First was a narrow woman on a roan with a split ear, hat pulled down against the chill, star pinned flat on a worn vest so it wouldn't brag. Sheriff Alma Ruiz. Beside her rode Nate Hollis, lean as a fence picket, and behind them a half-dozen citizens who had the look of men fetched out of beds and back doors. Zeke with a hammer tucked in his belt like it belonged at a parlor. 2 farmers with shotguns held muzzle low, and Nora Finch with a pencil behind one ear and a rifle she knew how to carry. Alma didn't ask permission to enter the light. She took the gap between torches as if the night had offered it to her. She drew up in the yard and let the roan blow. The law doesn't talk first when the ground is listening. Whitlock finally found his grin. "Well, look what the cat drug in. Sheriff, you're late to your own county." "Late," Alma said, voice even, but not lost. She slid a folded paper from her breast pocket and kept it low by her thigh. "I've got a wire from Santa Fe. The boy inside is under treaty protection while his people finish a judgment. Any interference becomes a territorial matter. Wire don't feed widows," Whitlock said. He eased his horse a half step to block her view of the house. "And it don't scare men who still remember what got took from 'em." Alma lifted her eyes to the ring of torches, to the faces there and the hands. "Anybody here remember the last time this much fire in one circle ended with something you were proud to tell your children?" She let the question sit. A few men looked down at their own boots like they'd stepped in something. Nate shifted his reins and put the roan's shoulder between Alma and Cole Brannigan's wide-eyed bay. Cole smiled a tired kind of smile. "Evening, Sheriff. We're just here to keep a neighbor safe. Heard he was harboring trouble." "That why your torches sit on his land and not yours?" Alma said. "Because you love him so much?" Zeke cleared his throat. He wasn't law, but there's a weight to a man who's held iron hot with his hands. "Marshal," he said to Whitlock without raising his voice, "you know this is wrong-headed." He didn't preach. He just said the thing that was too simple to argue and left it there. Whitlock's grin died. "Step back, Carter. This ain't a forge." He turned in the saddle, lifted his chin to the circle. "You came out here to be men. Don't turn into rabbits because a woman and a lantern scribbler showed up." Nora's pencil moved once, neat as a stitch, and went back behind her ear. "I'll spell every word you just said," she told the air, "and I don't misspell much." The yard held very still. Calder could feel Dassan's breath at his knee, quick and warm. He let his own steady for the both of them. He could see down the barrel of the moment. Whitlock needed one twitch to make his story true. Alma needed everyone else not to give it to him. "Hayes," Alma said without looking away from Whitlock. "You inside?" "I'm here," Calder answered. "You intend to keep your word to the mescalero?" "Yes, ma'am." "That'll do," she said, as if they had settled the only part that mattered. Whitlock's horse danced. The white-eyed bay stamped and flung sparks. Cole's hand floated above leather, not touching, not far. The men with torches found out all together how heavy flame gets when you begin to wonder what it might show about you. Alma unfolded the paper at last, not to wave it, just to have it there like a stone in a sling. "By order of the territorial governor," she said, "any attempt to remove the boy from this property tonight will be considered incitement under treaty statute. I will arrest the one who gives that order and the first man who tries to carry it out." She let her gaze fall dead center into Whitlock's face. "That starts with you, Marshal." He laughed again, smaller now. "You gonna pull on me, Ruiz, in front of all these decent folks? You think they'll let you?" "I don't think about decent folks," Alma said. "I think about the law. The decent folks think for themselves." A horse blew behind the line of torches, low and steady. Another answered from farther back, then another, not hurried, not shy. It wasn't the same noise as the posse, and it wasn't the shuffle of Whitlock's men restyling their courage. This sound came like a river you hadn't noticed in the dark, full and patient under the bank. Cole's head turned a fraction. "You hear that?" Whitlock heard. He tried to make his neck not notice. "More of your farmers, Sheriff. You run the county out of quilts." Nate slid his heel and edged the roan so Alma had a clean sightline both ways. Calder didn't move. May's hand went to the spoon without looking and pressed it quiet against the rim of the cup. In the firelight you could see every man's throat work when he swallowed. From the far side of the ring, beyond the torches and the men who thought they were the whole of the night, a shape stood up from the dark and chose to be seen. A rider on a paint with feathers that didn't shine so much as absorb the light and give it back in another color. Then two more behind him, and then, farther still, silent horses where the ground rises into the first cut of the hills. Alma didn't turn her head. Her eyes said she had already counted. Calder felt the boy lean just a breath toward the door. Whitlock finally pivoted in the saddle and saw what the rest of the night had brought. "Hell," he said, and the word was small in his mouth. Dawn thinned the dark without warming it. The torch ring dulled in the first wash of gray, and what had been only glow became faces and horses, and the hard ground they all stood on. Out beyond Whitlock's men, past the reach of their fire, riders eased into view one by one, quiet as dusk in a church. Feathers that had drunk the night gave the morning back in darker shades. Chief Ironcloud rode a paint with a scar across its nose like a thumbprint. He didn't hurry. His people fanned behind him and settled not quite a circle, not quite a line. Enough. Alma Ruiz didn't move her roan. She let her hat brim take the new light and kept that wire from Santa Fe tucked under her hand like a flat stone that knew its work. Nate Hollis shifted a knee, giving her angles. Zeke stood in the stirrups once to see, then sank back down and rested one hand on the hammer at his belt, like a prayer a man keeps to himself. Nora Finch slid the pencil from behind her ear and set it in the band of her hat, both hands free now, rifle resting easy across her thighs. May, at the door, reached for the spoon again and laid it quiet on the saucer so it wouldn't sing without asking. Whitlock turned his horse slow, as if all that leather might squeal and give him away. He tried on a grin and found it didn't fit. "You brought your choir, Sheriff," he said, voice dry. "I brought mine. Looks like they brought theirs." Chief Ironcloud let the paint stand in the mouth of the yard. He looked at the torches as if they were boys playing at being sons. His English came in measured pieces that could not be knocked over. "White men make much fire for one small boy," he said. "Maybe we use fewer flames, more thinking." A few of Whitlock's followers laughed because they needed something to sound like courage. Cole Brannigan didn't. He sat the white-eyed bay without blinking and watched the chief the way a wolf watches a fire that isn't afraid of wolves. Alma spoke low, not to take the air from anyone else's lungs. "Chief," she said, "you have my word I'm holding treaty law here. No one's taking the boy without due say." He inclined his head, no more than a leaf's worth, and let his gaze touch Calder's door. "He eats at your fire," he said to Alma without looking at her. "He heals." "He does," Alma said. Whitlock blew out a breath that wanted to be a snort. "Lord save us," he muttered loud enough to count. "We're trading pleasantries with paint and feathers while a thief winters on coffee." He straightened in the saddle and let his voice carry. "You people keep forgetting these folks understand one thing, not wires, not nods, one thing." The bowstrings came up like a single question, no shout, no drum, just the soft, taut note of gut drawn to wood. The sound slid into the yard and found bone. It stopped hands in mid-gesture and taught men how much air their throats could hold. Chief Ironcloud did not blink. He lifted 2 fingers and the strings held, not loosed. A small wind moved through the yucca and showed how thin the morning still was. Calder felt Dasan at his knee, a heat that wanted to be a shake, and was holding itself still by will alone. He set 2 knuckles against the boy's shoulder and left them there like a fence post. Alma didn't reach for anything. She had already drawn the line she needed. "Marshal Whitlock," she said, and his name in her mouth was a thing with edges. "You move 1 inch more toward that door and I take you." "If a man behind you fires, I take him. That's it, that's the law." Whitlock's jaw worked. His horse threw its head and he yanked at the bit too hard, an ugly tug that told more truth about him than his speeches. He looked left and right and found his men watching him, the way rabbits watch a hawk, to see which way it tilts its wing. He needed less sky and more echo. None came. Cole let his hand float above leather and then set it down again, palm open on his thigh, a small surrender to patience that pained him to make. "Marshal," he said, easy as breath, "this ain't the mud you want to die in." Whitlock swallowed something he couldn't spit out. He turned on the chief, needing somewhere to throw it. "You think you can wag a finger at me on my ground?" he said. "You and your—" The word he reached for would have soured the day past saving. He bit it in half. It still stank. The bows hummed again. A warning chord the earth itself seemed to answer. Chief Ironcloud looked through him the way a man looks through smoke to find the fire. "I settle with men," he said, "not boys in loud coats." His eyes were old and not unkind. "We keep laws to keep small mouths full when snow comes. Your law today, does it feed anyone?" The question went out and hung like a lantern from a beam. No one had noticed. You could see men flinch from the light and then try to stand up straight inside it. Zeke's hammer glinted once. Nora let out a breath she hadn't meant to hold and tipped her rifle muzzle a whisper to the ground so the morning would not mistake it. In the doorway, the stove ticked as if counting for all of them. Calder felt steady in a way that had nothing to do with guns. He kept his voice low. "Ma'am," he said toward Alma, "you still holding me to that wire?" "I am," she said without turning her head, "and I'm holding him to his word." Her chin cut toward Calder. "You bring the boy when the moon comes back." "I will," Calder said. "Then we have enough," Alma said. She didn't look at Whitlock. She didn't have to. The torch ring lost a little shape without losing numbers. Shoulders lowered a hair. One torch dipped and set a drop of pitch on a boot tip, where it burned and went out without telling a soul. Whitlock tried once more for a bigger voice. "What if I say no?" "Then you'll hear yes from a judge," Alma said, "in irons." Chief Ironcloud turned his palm up in a small, dry gesture that had been old before any of them were born. The bows eased an arrow's worth, nothing loosed, nothing wasted. A hawk cut a clean line across the brightening sky. The world remembered how to breathe. From behind the jam, the boy moved. The blanket slid off his shoulder, and he stood into the doorway like a sapling that had learned the wind's true size. His face was still too thin, and the scar across his back would never be pretty, but his shoulders did not shake. Dasan stepped out onto the porch, the whistle in his fist and his chin level, and the yard full of men looked at a child and saw something older than all of them. "Ew," Dasan stepped into the morning like a thread pulled clean through cloth. He was barefoot on the porch plank. The whistle Eli had carved tight in his fist, the bone of his wrist thin but unshaking, the paint on faces, the torches guttering in new light, the star on Alma's vest, the white eye of Cole's Bay. He took them all in and did not drop his chin. Calder felt him there, not pressed to his leg now, but standing at it, and set his hand along the boy's shoulder, 2 fingers down, a fence post more than a grip. "I broke law," the boy said, clear as creek glass. The words came careful, but they didn't wobble. "I learned. Let Calder speak for me when the elders judge." The yard changed shape. It wasn't much. A breath taken by men who had forgotten to do it. Bowstrings eased a hair. Zeke's shoulders let go half an inch. Nora's mouth did something like a prayer with no sound. Alma didn't move at all, but you could see breath return to the roan she sat. Chief Ironcloud's face did not soften so much as deepen. He looked at the boy the way a man looks at rain falling, where seed has already been put down. "You speak," he said, and it wasn't praise either. It was acceptance of a fact. Whitlock couldn't leave silence alone. He needed it to be about him, or he didn't know what to do with it. "I'll be damned if I stand here and let up." The word he reached for would have soured the next 10 years. He cut it off by drawing iron. The move was fast but not clean. He snatched at the Colt like a man grabbing at a ledge he knew was crumbling. Alma's gun was already in her hand when his cleared leather. She didn't shout. She didn't need to. "Marshal Whitlock," she said, voice flat and lawful as a ledger, "you are under arrest for incitement in violation of treaty statute and for threatening a protected person. Drop it, now." The bang never came. It hung there, unborn, because the world was too full of other sounds. The soft hum of bowstrings finding their last ounce, the click of Cole's hammer, hauled back by a thumb that wasn't sure who it meant to cover, the long hiss of a torch dying on damp sand where somebody's hand had started to shake. Whitlock stood with the Colt half high and the barrel not quite pointed, anywhere you could live. His face had gone the color of old lard. He looked left to his ring of men. Some had backed a horse a step. Some had turned their heads toward the mescalero without meaning to. One man stared at his own torch like it might say his name. Whitlock looked right to Cole and found nothing he could stand on there. The white-eyed bay rolled that eye and showed a sliver of tooth, bored with all of it. "Don't," Cole said low. "Not here." Alma's sights didn't waver. You could have hung a plumb line off her wrist. Nate slid the roan a notch to give her room for what came next, if it came. Nora's rifle lived steady at her thigh like a tuned instrument waiting. Nay. On the next note, it was born to play, but would rather not. Calder felt the boy's breath, the small hitch of it. He let his own ride slow and easy to loan the rhythm over. "You don't have to make it worse," he said toward Whitlock, not loud. "There's a road that backs out of this. Take it." Whitlock's mouth worked once, dry. Pride does a certain twitch when it realizes the only way left is down and quiet. He tried to smile and showed teeth. His finger tightened and then let go. The colt sagged an inch. "Let it fall," Alma said. It did. It hit dirt grip first and cut a dumb little furrow before it lay still. No one moved to kick it away. The bows stayed up. The day waited. Alma nodded once to Nate. He swung down, stepped in like he was going to pet a mean dog, and took the colt with 2 fingers by the trigger guard. He backed away, set it on the porch rail like a stray tool that didn't belong there, and pulled iron cuffs from his belt. The click they made when he opened them was small and decent, a household sound that had lost its temper. "Hands," Nate said. Whitlock stared at the sky, at nothing in it. Then he put his wrists out. Nate closed the cuffs. No gloat in it. Alma lowered her gun but didn't holster. "You don't put a thing away till the room says you can." Across the yard the boughs eased as Chief Ironcloud opened his palm. No arrow left to string. What had been a battle's width shrank to a space men could step across without falling. Cole let his hammer down slow, thumb between metal and mistake. He blew air through his teeth and hiked his shoulders like a man settling a saddle that never quite fit. "Ain't worth dying for this," he told Whitlock, maybe himself. Dasan stood straighter. He looked from the chief to Alma to Calder, and something in his eyes finished a job it had started the day hunger made him a thief. He lifted the whistle and didn't blow it, just set it on the rail beside the colt. Wood to iron, child to man. 2 shapes that said different futures out loud without any words at all. Chief Ironcloud gave a nod that might have been approval or might have been only acknowledgement that a crossroads had done its work. "The boy returns when the moon does," he said to the air, to the law, to the place itself. His gaze found Calder. "You bring him. You speak." "I will," Calder said. The wind came then, a thin run out of the east, and took smoke sideways so everybody could see everybody without blur. The torches guttered for lack of drama. Somewhere behind the yucca, a quail called and got an answer. Alma turned her horse without theater. "We're done for tonight," she said. "Anybody wants to test the wire, do it in front of a judge in the light of day." She tipped her hat to the chief, to Calder, to May at the door. "Ma'am." Whitlock stood with iron on his wrists and a little boy's hate in his face for anyone who'd seen him put them there. Nate took his reins and started him toward town. Dasan watched them go, then picked up his whistle again and slipped it back into his shirt. He did not look small anymore. The porch board under his bare feet felt the same, but it held more weight. What breaks a night isn't always noise. Sometimes it's the way men look at their own hands. After the cuffs clicked home on Whitlock's wrists, the yard settled into a hush that had the shape of church after the hymn. Nate took the marshal's reins and turned him toward the road. Whitlock tried to make his back tall. The iron made its own argument, and won. Alma stayed a moment longer, letting the air decide if it meant to hold. She kept her pistol low, not away, eyes on the ring that had wanted to be a fire, and was now only a crowd remembering it, had stoves to tend. "Go on home," she said, not loud. "Put your torches out before they tell your boys what you were ready to do." One by one, flame tips dipped to the dirt and hissed. The men who'd held them worked at their faces like Dust had blown into their eyes. A farmer with a red neckerchief tried to meet Nora Finch's look and couldn't. She'd already written what she needed to and had nothing left to say to him. Zeke rode through the slack in the circle with a bucket hooked in one elbow and set it by Alma's roan. The mare nosed the rim and drank. Zeke lifted it so she didn't have to stretch. "Ma'am," he said, "because respect is a thing you keep watered too." Under the eave, May stepped down with 2 tin cups steaming and crossed to the edge of the mescalero line like a woman bringing bread to a new neighbor. She didn't try for the chief. She picked a young warrior whose paint had wept a little in the heat and whose fingers had learned to ease a bowstring without shame. She held a cup out, palm down so it wouldn't read like a bargain. He looked to Iron Cloud, got nothing but a stillness that wasn't no, and took the handle with careful fingers. He didn't sip at first. He held the heat in his hands and let it work across the ache the long wait had put there. When he did drink, he closed his eyes a breath, and when he opened them, they were just eyes again, not weapons. Cole Brannigan sat his bay a long beat, like a man waiting for someone else to tell him what kind of man he was. Then he reached across his belt and unhooked a short iron he kept low on the offside, a tidy piece meant for close rooms and bad ideas. He let it drop into the dust where it made a small thud that felt bigger than it sounded. "Ain't the mud I'd die in," he said to nobody, and if it was a prayer, it was the kind even the Lord could get behind. Chief Iron Cloud raised his hand, palm out. The bows went soft all down the line, cords easing, arrows slipping back to rest. He brought the paint forward 2 steps and stopped in the open where the porch, the law, and the men from town could see him without squinting. The scar across the horse's nose looked like someone had tried to erase a word and changed its meaning instead. "The boy returns when the moon does," he said. He could have shouted. He didn't need to. "You bring him. You speak." His eyes held Calder's, and there was nothing in them of threat. Only the weight that comes with being believed or found out. If he is harmed, we come, not to talk. The words landed the way a brand lands, clean, final, oddly kind if a man meant to remember. "I'll bring him," Calder said, "on my own horse, on my own trail." He didn't add much obliged. Some promises don't take polish. Alma slid her gun into leather. She breathed once, and it was the first easy breath the yard had tasted since sundown. "Chief," she said, tipped her brim, "I'll file my paper before noon." She turned to Calder. "Keep your door braced and your coffee hot. You'll have neighbors again tomorrow, the kind who look in on each other." It wasn't a threat. It was a prescription for a place trying to be worth living in. Nate swung up and took Whitlock toward town at a steady walk that said there'd be no gallop, no show. The men who'd come to be a blaze found they were just men, and they trailed after in pairs and threes, without admitting it to each other. A dropped torch smoked itself out in a curl that smelled like a lie cooling. May handed the second cup to Zeke. He passed it across to another mescalero with a gray feather tucked behind his ear. The man nodded once, drank, and looked past everyone to the boy on the porch. Dasan stood straight as fenced steel, the whistle hidden in his shirt like a kept promise. He didn't wave. Children from good stock learn when not to. Nora pushed her pencil back behind her ear and shut her notebook with a thumb. "Paper'll say it," she told Alma, who gave her a look that meant write it for truth and not for heat. And Nora nodded once. "Truth sells better anyhow," she added, and for once nobody argued. The corral horses found their breath again and snorted the last of the fear out. A breeze came out of the north and made the coffee steam walk off the top of May's cups. Calder stepped to the post and looked at the glass tube there. The stubborn tear of water had held through the whole of it. As he watched, The bead let go and fell to the mark he'd scratched there years ago with a nail. A man could make a sermon out of that if he was built for sermons. Chief Ironcloud shifted the paint and set his chin toward the east. "We go," he said. "Hunt waits, work waits, judgment waits its right day." He lifted 2 fingers to Calder, not a salute, not quite a blessing. Behind him his people turned as one body that had learned how to be strong without being hard all the way through. The young warrior with the damp paint handed May's empty cup back like a borrowed tool and touched the brim of a hat he didn't wear. May smiled the small kind and took it. Alma gathered her reins. "Mr. Hayes," she said, "we're square." She looked at the boy. "Son, eat what's put in front of you, and when it's time, stand up straight." Dasan nodded like he'd been doing that his whole life and had only just found out there was a name for it. The yard, emptying, learned how to sound like a yard again. Fence wire singing thin, a fly bumping a window, the stove ticking as it cooled. Calder watched the last backs go small against the flats, then smaller. He reached down, picked up coals dropped iron by the barrel, and set it on the porch rail alongside the whistle's mark where wood had pressed. Iron and wood, loud and quiet, both caught a little sun. From the saddle's shadow the chief's voice came once more, not to add weight, but to fix it in place. "Moon's turn," he said. "You bring him. You speak." "I will," Calder said. The paint moved. The line unstitched itself without a snag, and the day took the shape of a day again, though it would not be the same kind. Afternoon came on thin and gold, the kind that puts brass on the edges of things and makes even old wire look worth keeping. The flats breathed easy for the first time in a spell. A pair of ravens worked slow circles over Agua Fria, and down in the greasewood a string of quail ran like a spilled necklace, clicking to themselves. Calder set a sheet of foolscap on the table, weighted the corners with a salt shaker and a cartridge, and uncapped a fountain pen that had his teeth marks in the barrel. The nib scratched the way a cricket sings in a warm wall. He didn't write pretty. He wrote true. Name, place, date, what he'd seen, what he'd promised. He kept the sentences short so a man wouldn't trip on them. Boy arrived hungry. Welt's present. Fed him. Agreed to return him at Moon's turn. The ink came out brown where the bottle had seen one long winter too many. Nora Finch sat opposite, wrist straight, copying in a neat clerk's hand onto a second sheet. She asked for a spelling now and then and got a nod for an answer. The pencil behind her ear left a clean groove where it had lived all morning. When she finished, she blew grit from the paper, squared the pages, and tapped the stack once on the tabletop, like a woman truing a rifle sight. 2 copies, she said. Mine gets mailed. Yours goes east with you. May worked at the other end of the room with a length of blue cloth that had once been part of a flour sack label. She cut it down to a patch and pressed it flat with the heel of her hand. Shirt, she said, and Dawson lifted his arms. She stitched the square over the place where the scar would rub, not to hide it, not like that. Just so cotton wouldn't pick at new skin, her thread ran small and tight, each bite of the needle saying, "You're mended here, and you're not alone." "There," she murmured when it lay right. "Blue's kinder on a boy's back than memory." Zeke brought a tin of harness oil and a strap he'd rubbed soft. He looped the strap through the Dun's breast collar, set his palm to the horse's chest, and nodded at the feel of it. "Trail east ain't rough if it don't have to be," he said. He checked the cinch holes and left the punch on the porch rail, where Calder would see it. A man can do kindness without putting his face in it. Eli Downs came at sundown with his hair mashed under a hat, too big for him, and his best try at a look that said he wasn't carrying anything on purpose. He was. From his pocket he lit out a rawhide thong, braided clumsy and honest, with a spent .44 casing worked into it like a bead. For your whistle, he told Dussin, ears going red, so you don't lose it if you run. He flushed harder. I mean, not run like... He shut his mouth and grinned crooked. For luck, buddy. Dussin touched the brass with one finger, ran the thong through the whistle's notch, and put it on over his head. The cartridge rocked against his sternum, 3 soft taps, like it had finally decided to be done with noise. Doc Grady showed in the doorway and didn't come in all the way. He sniffed the air like he could smell a lie and found none. He signed the bottom of Calder's statement with a hand that had stitched 100 calves and a few men who'd been as hard-headed. Witness, he said, and the pen left a tidy scrawl that looked steadier than he was. They ate early. Beans, skillet bread, a heel of maize apple butter that had survived the week by hiding on a high shelf. Calder didn't make a speech. He slid half his bread onto the boy's plate and watched him break it careful, as if he meant not to waste the good of it or the lesson in it. Outside, the light leveled and turned the yard into a page you could read without squinting. Calder folded his statement once and slid it into the inside pocket of his coat, the one you use for things that would get you killed if they fell out. He ran a thumb down the seam to feel at home. Nora handed him the copy. He laid that in the saddlebag with a coil of line, and the pouch of medicine Iron Cloud had tossed him. He set the Winchester where it lived and left it there. Some trails you ride unarmed because the weight of a gun pulls a man's mind the wrong way. The drum came up from the east after dark, not loud and not near, the way thunder talks when it's still thinking about making weather. Dussin stopped mid-breath and turned his head toward it. He didn't move his feet. He just listened, and his face did something no grown man in the room could name right off. He lifted his fingers to the blue patch without touching it, and then let his hand fall. He looked at Calder, mouth working once like words had come and gone before he could net them. Calder saved him the trouble. "We ride at first light," he said. "Eat before we go. Coffee'll be thin, but it'll be warm." Dawson nodded. He sat down by the stove and polished the whistle with his thumb, not to make it shine, but to make it his. May laid a roll of clean cloth beside him and a small tin with holes punched in the lid that smelled of sage when you breathed close. Zeke left the punch on the rail, and beside it, a little horseshoe nail bent into a hook. Eli went home lighter by 1 talisman and taller by an inch you couldn't see. When the house went quiet, the quiet was a friendly thing. The stove ticked and settled. Outside, a nightbird called once and got an answer. Calder sat with his coat on and his hat brim pulled down, not sleeping, not quite awake, holding the shape of the road in his head so it would feel familiar when the day came. The boy slept on his side like before, one hand on the whistle, breath slow. The pen lay uncapped on the table, ink drying to a film that would crack if you touched it, a sentence finished and waiting for the next one that had to be lived before it could be written. They rode at gray light when the country forgets its colors and remembers only shape. Calder took the creek bed where it ran shallow and stony, then cut uphill through a stand of yucca that rattled like bones. The dun kept an easy walk. Dussin sat straight behind the saddle horn, one hand on the swell, the other tucked inside his shirt where the whistle knocked soft against the .44 casing Eli had braided to it. The blue patch May had sewn lay smooth under his shirt and didn't pull when the horse stepped down. They topped a rise and saw it, smoke drawn into a thin column as neat as a signature, and beyond it a low flat of ground swept clean of stones. Men and women stood at the rim, not crowding, not curious. A fire burned in the center, not a pile, but a circle, built with care, mesquites stacked so the coals would last past talk and into work. On the far side were the old ones, seated, hair the color of ash, faces cut deep by weather that didn't apologize. Chief Ironcloud waited apart, reins loose, horse dozing as if the day were a long song he already knew. He looked at the boy first. The nod he gave was small, and a man could miss it if he wanted to, but Dasan didn't. He slid from the saddle and stood with his shoulders square. Calder swung down and laid the reins over the Dun's neck. He kept his hat on because this wasn't a church and wasn't a court, and yet had more of both than many. No speeches began it. A woman came from the far side with a gourd of water and held it so the boy could drink. He did, careful, a mouthful and no more, then handed it back. An elder lifted a stick with a bead of red on the end and drew a mark in the dust. The fire popped once in the cool. A man spoke first in a language Calder didn't own. He didn't need the words to hear sentence and question in them. The old man turned his palm toward Dasan. The boy stepped forward and said what he'd come to say. That he'd taken winter corn when fear ran him thin. That hunger had taught him to think with his hands. That a rope and a fence and a last biscuit at another man's table had put different lessons in him. He didn't cry. He didn't ask. He told a simple truth and stood in it. Ironcloud faced Calder. "You speak," he said. Calder cleared his throat and found he didn't have much to clear. "Kid came to my place with his back tore up and his belly empty," he said. "He ate what was put down. He learned to tie good knots and read a skiff for trouble. He learned that sharing's not a favor out here. It's how a place keeps going. Mercy don't make a boy soft. It makes him steady." He left it there. A man can ruin a good sentence by adding one more. The elders sat a while without sound. A hawk rode a lazy circle above the last of the smoke. Somebody's baby fussed and then found sleep again. When the oldest woman spoke, her voice worked like a needle, small, strong, pulling past and present into one thread. An elder beside her stood and walked to the pole that leaned near the fire. A whip hung coiled there, dark and polished with use. He took it down, laid it across both hands, then lifted his eyes to Ironcloud. The chief held the moment like a bridle. Then he shook his head. The elder turned and carried the whip past the fire to a beam set in the ground. He hung the leather high where sun could find it and dry it hard, where boys could see it and remember, where men could see it and think twice. Ironcloud spoke to the old ones in his language, and they answered with a slow lift of chins. He turned back. "Law holds," he said, "but what law wants is mouths full and boys true. He does not take the lash. He takes work." He pointed east with 2 fingers. "Our water-keeper takes him, 1 moon for learning. Each season he stands before the fire and tells what he did with his hands for his people. If he forgets, this," his eyes touched the hung coil, "reminds." Dasan nodded. A breath left him, the kind a man doesn't know he's kept till it's gone. He stepped to the fire and bent, pressing both palms to the packed earth just outside the heat, the place between burn and cold. When he stood, there were small crescents of clean in the dust where his hands had been. Calder took the paper from his inside pocket and gave it to Ironcloud. The chief did not read it. He looked Calder in the face while his fingers understood the weight of the page. "You kept your word," he said. "You will keep it again." "I will," Calder said. "If you need me to speak, I speak." "Some speak with mouths," Ironcloud said. "Some with how they sit a horse." A corner of his mouth moved, almost a smile. "You did both." The woman with the gourd brought it to Calder. He drank the way the boy had, 1 mouthful, cool and plain. She took the gourd back and tipped a little water on the dust for those not there to drink. The fire made a settling sound, as if it had been asked to watch a boy grow and had said yes. When it ended without fanfare. An old man put a hand on Dasan's shoulder and sent him toward a rider with tools bound behind his saddle. The water-keeper. The rider lifted the boy up and set him like a partner, and not a load. Iron Cloud took Calder's forearm in a grip that had more truth than signatures. "When you ride east and need a fire," he said, "put your hat on a mesquite's low branch and wait. We'll see it." Calder nodded once. "Much obliged." He found the Dunn's reins and turned for home. Behind him, a kid with a blue patch on his shirt and a whistle at his throat rode away toward work that would keep a valley alive. Above the ring, the hung whip did nothing at all. That was the point. 6 months folded up like a bedroll and put themselves on a shelf. When they came down again, the Pecos ran shy but honest, carrying a green ghost along its banks that hadn't walked there in years. The gauge on Calder's post wore a new ring of salt, a thumb higher than the last, and a little moss had the nerve to try living in the trough under the cottonwoods. Out in the side channel, a blue heron stood like a thought a man didn't want to scare off. Coyote Bend changed its gait. Wagons began to stop without a hand on a rifle first. Crates of beans traded for rawhide, flour for horseshoe nails, calico for 2 sacks of piñon. Alma Ruiz set a sawhorse across the street outside the Rio Ledger and wrote, "Market day on plank, not fancy, just enough." She sat her roan by the well and kept the kind of order that lets people forget it's there. Nora Finch took pictures with a box camera that sighed like a harmonica every time it swallowed a square of light. Zeke Carter set up an anvil on a stump and tightened shoes while the owner still held the reins, iron talking to iron in a steady language. Men shook hands over nothing more than a price and didn't look around to see who might hate them for it. Mescalero riders came in on a line like geese, no hurry. They wore trade shirts and old coats and the same faces they always had, watchful, dry-humored, unfooled. Chief Iron Cloud didn't sit center. He let a younger man do that and looked pleased when nobody acted like it mattered. The waterkeeper walked with a boy 1 inch taller than he'd been, his shirt patched blue at the back where a scar had stopped complaining. The boy's whistle hung against a spent .44 case, the brass winking when he breathed. If you didn't know to look, you might have missed him as any kid in a crowd. If you did know, it would catch in your throat a moment and then pass, the way the right kind of pride does. Calder stacked 2 sacks of salt by May's step and humped a barrel of coffee inside. The room smelled of cinnamon and wood smoke and the stubborn sweetness of apple butter she'd stretched into winter like a woman who refuses to see the bottom of a jar. She wiped a hand on her apron and put a cup in his palm without asking. "Careful," she said, because the cup was hot, and because the day was too. "Always am," he lied, and blew across the rim. The coffee tasted like something earned. Eli Downs tumbled in with cheeks windburned and a hat that still didn't fit. He laid a small fish on the counter, proud as a banker with a note paid, and said, "Caught him in the return ditch, swear to God." May raised a brow toward the ceiling and set a skillet on, and Eli grinned at the floor and swore less. Outside, someone laughed the way you do when a deal goes right and nobody had to bleed for it. Alma leaned in at the door long enough to say, "Whitlock took train east in chains 3 months back. Judge had no use for his stories." She tapped the star flat against her vest. "Paperwork, Hayes. Not as satisfying as thunder, but it waters more ground." "Much obliged," Calder said. He meant for more than that. Late in the afternoon, Iron Cloud stepped to the porch with the waterkeeper and the boy. They didn't come to make a show. They came the way you check a fence you trust. The boy stood straight, hands easy at his sides, eyes on the yard like he belonged to it and to someplace else at the same time. "You look taller," Calder said. Dasan considered it and then nodded once, grave. "Water's heavier than it looks," he said. "I carry some. It carries me some." "Fair trade," Calder said. Ironcloud's gaze took in the gauge, the trough moss, the way men stood near one another without flinching. "Place breathes better," he said. "Men too." "Work of many hands," May said from inside, as if correcting a child gentle. She slid a plate across the counter. "Let the boy eat." Dasan stepped forward, took what was put down, said thank you like someone who meant to keep using the word, and ate with the slow care of a person who remembers what hurrying cost. The whistle tapped the 44 brass 3 quiet times against his chest, as if counting new rules. Take what you need, leave a little, come back. When the light went long, the market thinned to conversations and long shadows. Zeke packed his tools, Nora wrapped her camera. Alma lifted down the market day plank and leaned it against the ledger for next time. The waterkeeper shook Calder's hand with a grip that felt like a gate latch. Plain, sound, nothing tricky. Ironcloud took May's coffee in both hands and drank it like medicine that happened to be kind. Calder walked to the porch rail and set his palm against the post where the gauge lived its small life. The new salt ring bit his skin just enough to say, "Remember." Out beyond the cottonwoods, a breeze came down the draw and laid its cool on the back of his neck. He looked east to where the Mescalero Hills stood up blue and inevitable. He looked west where the trail turned into guesswork. He looked at May, who was drying a cup with the same attention she gave a prayer. "You staying, Mr. Hayes?" she asked without looking up, as if she were asking the stove whether it meant to hold its heat. He took his time. A man can ruin a good answer by rushing it. He set the cup she'd given him on the rail, watched the last curl of steam walk off it, and set it plain so it would hold in the bones of the porch. "I will not leave." Night settled like a shawl, soft and serviceable. The lamp in Calder's window breathed slow with the draft, and the cottonwoods on the creek whispered the kind of talk men don't need to answer. Crickets sauced at the dark till it felt like water moving. The gauge on the post caught a sliver of starlight and wore its new ring of salt like a plain badge. Hoofsteps came light across the yard, not a rider's weight, not trouble. Calder set his cup down and let the screen door sigh open against his palm. A yearling sorrel stood at the edge of the porch light, with its ears up and its patience good. A boy led it, taller by an inch, shoulders leveled out, hair tied back with a strip of blue cloth that had learned another use. The whistle at his throat tapped a spent .44 case with each breath, soft as a clock that had stopped needing to tell time for anybody but itself. Dasan touched 2 fingers to his hat brim. He had one now, a little battered, honest with sweat. He didn't climb the steps. He opened his hand and set something on the bottom tread. A tight sheaf of corn, first pick, husks braided and bound with that same blue. He didn't say what any man with eyes could read. "Thank you. We made it. You helped." "Come on, kid," Calder said, not to pull him in so much as to make room for him. "Coffee's hot. May'll skin me if I let you stand there empty-handed." May came anyway, apron caught in at the hip. 2 cups and a plate with the last heel of apple cake she'd been hiding from temptation. "Evening, son," she said, like he'd walked in from the barn and not from counting gates between worlds. She poured, set, and stepped back, letting quiet sit at the table where it liked to sit. The sorrel nickered once and nosed at a knot in the porch rail. Dasan turned the halter loose, and the colt stayed because some animals know where they've been welcomed even if nobody whistles. The boy wrapped his hands around the tin and breathed the steam like medicine. "How's the keeper?" Calder asked after the coffee found its depth. "Laughs when the gate sticks," Dasan said. English steady now, but still careful at the corners. "Says water teaches patience or it drowns you in the learning." He paused, not for effect, but to find the truest word. "I believe him." Calder nodded. "Man's right." Dasan looked toward the post where the gauge held starlight, then to the place on the porch rail where iron had lain, the night a law learned to be enough, and finally to the peg by the door where a small leather pouch still hung, ugly with hard use and handsome with the truth of why it was there. He slid the thong over his head. The whistle and the .44 case came away together. A small weight of boy and bullet turned into something gentler than either had been alone. "For you," he said, and his voice thinned just a little, like a river going into a narrow bend. "He keeps me now." He touched his chest where the string had been, not like a man reaching for what he'd lost, but like one checking that the place for it would stay open. Calder took the whistle and felt the rub his thumb had left in the wood from months of worry and waiting. He didn't put it in a pocket. He stepped to the door, lifted the pouch from its peg, and hung the whistle beside it so the two knocked once against each other and learned they'd be neighbors. Wood and leather, mercy and warning. A house ought to carry both. Zeke's hammer clicked once out back, habit more than work. Eli whooped from the return ditch and then hushed himself like a boy who'd remembered the hour. Somewhere down the bend, Alma's roan stamped, and the sound came through the cottonwoods like a promise rather than a threat. The world had not turned holy. It had turned livable. Dasan finished the cake crumb by crumb, the way a body honors what fed it once when food was scarce. He set the cup down and stood. No speeches. He gathered the sorrel's lead and ran a hand down the colt's neck, finding burrs by feel and flicking them away. He stepped to the bottom tread and touched the braided corn with 2 fingers. "First harvest," he said, "Are for your porch." "Much obliged," Calder answered. "Tell Ironcloud my door's got 2 hinges and both swing for him." The boy's mouth tipped. Something almost a grin, almost a prayer. "He knows," he said. He gathered the halter and led the colt out of the wash of lamplight, stopping once to look east where the dark stacked up into hills, and once to look west where the trail turned into more trail. He didn't look back a third time. May picked up the empty plate and held it against her belly, a breath like a woman fixing a thing without thread. "He'll be all right," she said. "He already is," Calder told her. He wasn't guessing. He stepped to the post and laid his hand on the glass tube, the salt ring cool under his palm. The whistle knocked once against the pouch in a small draught. The cottonwoods whispered and the crickets kept time, and the year did what years do when men have decided to make them useful. "Folks out here ain't perfect," he said, not to the night so much as to the boards under his boots, and the woman at his shoulder and the boy walking off with a good horse. "But we can be decent." He glanced at the cup cooling on the rail, at the corn on the step, at the peg by the door. "That's enough to stay."